Imagine walking through a swamp where the fog clings to your skin, where the air smells of decay and something unspoken brushes against your mind. In the dense marshlands of South Carolina, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds and the water mirrors an unnatural darkness, there lies a place no map dares name. If you dare to face the truth behind this story, hit that subscribe button now and press the bell icon, because the next revelation should reach you before anyone else. Locals whisper about it in fear, passing on fragmented tales of a chapel where mercy came with a price so high no soul should ever pay it. This is where the Selkirk Orphanage sisters vanished, and what you are about to hear has been deliberately buried for nearly 2 centuries. The story begins in 1789, in a world freshly scarred by revolution, a society teetering between freedom and ruin. Here, in the shadowed Low Country, the Selkirk Orphanage once stood as a beacon of hope, a sanctuary for children abandoned by circumstance, left to fate's cruelty. But hope is fragile, and when placed in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. Behind the ornate doors of Angel's Rest Chapel, the sisters, gentle caretakers of the orphanage, believed they were bringing light into darkness. Instead, they walked unknowingly into a calculated nightmare, orchestrated by a family whose influence stretched like roots under the soil, unseen yet deadly. The Whitworths, pillars of the community and masters of deception, had carved their empire through manipulation, control, and secrecy. Gabriel Whitworth, the patriarch, exuded a presence that silenced rooms and hearts alike. His family was trained not just in survival or wealth, but in the meticulous craft of domination. By day, they were respected, devout members of society. By night, they perfected horrors hidden behind polished facades, and the orphanage, so willingly entrusted to them, became a stage for the unspeakable. Records later discovered, sealed immediately by authorities, hint at horrors that defy belief. Meticulous documentation of lives harvested under the guise of salvation. Children disappeared, hope was stolen, and those who sought refuge found themselves trapped in a labyrinth designed to break both body and spirit. The very walls, once meant to protect innocence, became instruments of suffering. Every prayer whispered, every candle lit, served only as a mask for something far darker. Tonight we pull back the veil. We enter the shadows the world tried to forget. And as you listen, understand this: once these truths lodge in your mind, there is no returning. You will see the world not as it appears, but as it has always been, ruled by hidden hands, by forces willing to sacrifice the innocent to maintain power. The Selkirk sisters did not vanish by chance. They were erased with purpose, and you are about to understand why. The Selkirk Orphanage. Sisters arrived at Angel's Rest Chapel believing they had found sanctuary, unaware that every step they took was being watched, measured, and catalogued. Gabriel Whitworth's gaze, cold and calculating, missed nothing, and behind him the machinery of his family's sinister enterprise hummed with precision. Each sister, each child, each innocent soul seeking refuge was carefully classified, their strengths, weaknesses, and secrets recorded in ledgers so detailed they could guide the family's hands long after the victim's life had ended. Miriam Whitworth, the daughter whose beauty masked a merciless cunning, welcomed the sisters with smiles that hid teeth sharpened on manipulation. She asked the questions that seemed innocent, the kind that built trust, while unspooling the threads of lives into patterns the family could exploit. Meanwhile, the twins Cain and Abel moved silently among the rooms, planting stories and rumors designed to confuse and entrap, their words forming invisible webs that left no escape. In the basement, hidden behind an altar that had once promised holiness, the first glimpses of horror waited, a space designed not for prayer, but for precision, a place where screams could be contained, measured, and prolonged for maximum extraction of information and obedience. The sisters, kind-hearted and trusting, believed in the sanctity of their work, tending to children and praying for lost souls. But each day they spent there fed the Whitworths' understanding of human psychology. Their techniques refined with every confession, every tremor of fear, every tear shed in desperation. The family had built not just a home or a chapel, but a system, a carefully maintained network of surveillance and control stretching beyond the Low Country into neighboring states, corrupting officials, ministers, and merchants alike, weaving a shield around their crimes that no casual observer could penetrate. And yet the sisters' intuition began to prick at the edges of their awareness, subtle alarms in the back of their minds that something was profoundly wrong. Shadows moved too deliberately, voices echoed in ways that felt rehearsed, and the patterns of the children's fear, once unnoticeable, started to reveal the invisible strings controlling them. They tried to speak up, to question, but the world outside was as silent as the swamp around them. Authorities complicit through ignorance or design, neighbors trusting the polished surface of the Whitworth name. By the time the sisters realized that refuge had become a cage, it was already too late. Every exit, every plea for help, every attempt to document or report what they had seen had been anticipated and neutralized. And in that chilling quiet, the first of the Selkirk sisters vanished into the basement, swallowed by the machinery of control so expertly built that history would remember nothing but absence, leaving behind only a whisper, a shadow, and a question that would haunt the Low Country for generations. What really happened to the Selkirk Orphanage sisters, and who, truly, could ever be trusted again? The days at Angel's Rest Chapel became a calculated rhythm of deception, each movement choreographed to erode trust and dissolve resistance. The Selkirk Orphanage sisters, once confident in their mission to care for abandoned children, began to sense a subtle wrongness, a weight in the air that refused to dissipate. Every gesture of kindness from the Whitworth family carried a hidden agenda. Miriam's smiles, warm and radiant, coaxed information from the sisters while binding them in a web of psychological dependence. Cain and Abel's stories of fabricated escapees planted fear, confusion, and false hope in equal measure, conditioning the sisters to question their own judgment. The children in their care, innocent pawns, displayed behaviors that were alarming and inconsistent, learned from the twins' manipulations, and the sisters, desperate to maintain authority and protect the vulnerable, found themselves trapped in a system they could neither comprehend nor control. Beneath the altar, the basement loomed, a silent promise of annihilation. The first disappearances were not loud or chaotic. They were methodical, almost clinical. A sister would escort a child to the storage rooms or to the so-called infirmary and never return. Each vanishing was recorded with meticulous care, numbered, annotated, and archived in the Whitworth ledgers as if it were a natural transaction of life. Seraph Whitworth, whose knowledge of anatomy had once been reserved for healing, now ensured that the bodies could be manipulated, preserved, and presented as something they were not, while extracting every secret the victims unknowingly carried. The sisters felt the walls closing in, a sensation that intensified each passing hour, yet every plea to leave or question the family was subtly undermined. Neighbors who might have helped were deceived by the Whitworths' public piety. Local officials, bribed or coerced, turned blind eyes. Even religious authorities trusted the facade, never suspecting that the sermons and hymns masked ritualized horror. Slowly, the sisters' spirits began to fracture, each moment of doubt met with another layer of manipulation. Sweet words, strategic kindness, and psychological games designed to twist morality into complicity. Fear became a teacher, and silence, a survival mechanism. By the end of the first week, it was no longer merely the children who were in danger, but the Selkirk sisters themselves, caught in a labyrinth of unseen forces, where every corridor, every smile, and every whispered reassurance was a carefully placed instrument of control, leading them deeper into darkness, toward a fate that history would soon record only as disappearance. The Whitworths' control over the Selkirk sisters was not built with chains or brute force alone. It was crafted in shadows, in the subtle erosion of will, in the meticulous conditioning of trust and fear intertwined. Each day, the sisters were subjected to a curriculum of manipulation disguised as guidance, prayers that subtly praised obedience above morality, conversations that questioned their judgment while flattering their compassion, and orchestrated events that made them witnesses to horrors they could barely comprehend. Miriam would walk among them, her presence disarming, her words soft but laced with insinuation, teaching them that resistance was futile, that questioning the family's intentions was itself a moral failing. Cain and Abel moved invisibly, their fabricated stories and staged interactions turning perception against perception, making the sisters doubt their own senses, their own understanding of reality. Even the children, instruments of fear and confusion, were deployed strategically. Their cries, their inexplicable behaviors, and the small betrayals they unknowingly committed reinforced the sense that the outside world could not be trusted, that sanctuary and danger were now indistinguishable. Behind closed doors, Seraph Whitworth perfected his craft. Medical knowledge twisted into a tool of control, pain administered in precise dosages, techniques to prolong suffering while extracting confessions and secrets, all while leaving no visible mark that could betray the family's designs. Slowly, the sisters' resolve eroded. Their courage, once unwavering, began to fracture under the weight of constant psychological assault. Each disappearance of a child or caretaker became a silent lesson in futility, teaching them that intervention was impossible and survival required compliance. They began to internalize the Whitworth logic, accepting the family's narrative as truth, even as their instincts screamed otherwise. Fear became a currency, trust a trap, and morality a shifting, unreliable guide. The very sanctity of their mission, care, protection, nurture, was weaponized against them, forcing them into complicity in ways so subtle they hardly recognized the descent. And yet, even as the walls of Angel's Rest Chapel seemed to close tighter, there remained a flicker of resistance in the sisters' eyes, a stubborn thread of humanity refusing total surrender. That flicker, though, would be tested beyond anything imaginable, for the Whitworths had only begun the systematic dismantling of their identity, a slow, deliberate annihilation that history would later record not as atrocity, but as disappearance, leaving behind only questions, shadows, and the haunting certainty that what had happened there was far from random, far from accidental, and far from forgivable. The first full night at Angel's Rest Chapel revealed the true depth of the Whitworths' design, a night where the sanctuary became a theater of controlled terror and the sisters' sense of reality began to fracture irrevocably. Darkness settled over the swamplands, thick and suffocating, and within the chapel, lights flickered in ways that seemed purposeful, guiding attention, creating shadows that whispered threats where none existed. The sisters, exhausted from the day's careful routines, were gathered under the pretense of a devotional service, a ritual meant to soothe the children and reinforce the illusion of divine purpose. But each sermon, each prayer, was layered with subtle psychological conditioning, messages cloaked in morality, asserting obedience, diminishing doubt, teaching them that defiance equaled damnation. Miriam moved among the orphans and sisters alike, her hands gentle on shoulders, her gaze warm, yet every touch left the silent imprint of control, every word a calculated nudge toward submission. Cain and Abel's stories, whispered during the evening hours, twisted perceptions of the outside world, convincing the sisters that any attempt at escape or communication with outsiders was not only impossible, but morally wrong, a sin against the very lives they had vowed to protect. Below them, in the basement, Seraph prepared the instruments of obedience, not for all, But for the first of the disappearances that night, a calculated extraction designed to instill terror, not mere compliance. The sisters heard muffled cries, faint at first, as if carried from another realm, and then the unmistakable sound of a life being taken with precision and intent. Fear gripped them, yet it was interwoven with a confusing sense of responsibility. Their instinct was to intervene, to protect, but the environment had been engineered so cleverly that hesitation, confusion, and guilt immobilized action. They began to understand that the chapel itself was a weapon, a structure designed to contain, to manipulate, to break down resistance systematically. As the night wore on, whispers of children who had vanished earlier filtered through the halls, and every sound, the rustle of fabric, the creak of floorboards, felt laden with unseen eyes and unspoken threats. By dawn, the sisters were no longer merely visitors. They had become participants in a meticulously orchestrated machine of domination, their identities fraying, their moral compass spinning, each heartbeat a reminder that sanctuary had been replaced by a trap, and that the Whitworths were masters not just of manipulation, but of absolute psychological control, a control so complete that it could erase both the innocent and the aware, leaving only shadows in the world's memory. The first Selkirk sister to vanish did not scream. She was swallowed quietly, almost imperceptibly, by the machinery of the Whitworths' design. A disappearance so precise it left no immediate trace, only an absence that would ripple through the hearts of those still clinging to hope. She had been tending to the children in the nursery, humming softly to calm their rising anxieties, when Miriam approached, her smile serene, her hands steady, guiding the sister toward a side room supposedly for supplies. The door closed behind her, and the sound of it clicking shut was the last ordinary noise she would ever make. Below, Sarif's careful preparations had ensured that every motion, every step, was controlled. The basement, a labyrinth of cells and instruments designed for maximum psychological effect, waited like a predator for its prey. Cain and Abel, already masters of subtle terror, orchestrated distractions above, keeping the children calm, their attention drawn away, their trust in the environment reinforced, even as the first of the sisters was led into captivity. The remaining sisters felt the shift immediately, a psychic echo of her absence, a subtle but profound change in the energy of the building. Fear, once abstract, became tangible, a living presence curling around their ribs, tightening with every muffled sound, every displaced object, every shadow that moved just beyond the corner of the eye. They began to realize that no door, no corridor, no whispered plea could protect them. The environment itself had been weaponized, each architectural choice and familial tactic engineered to strip away autonomy, leaving only obedience and dread. The children, confused and terrified, clung to the remaining sisters, but even their innocence had been co-opted, trained to serve the Whitworths' purposes in ways the sisters could not yet fully comprehend. By midday, the remaining sisters were navigating a new reality, one of calculated silence, of perpetual surveillance, and of the horrifying understanding that the disappearance was not an anomaly, but a demonstration, a methodical lesson designed to show what awaited anyone who resisted. In that moment, the walls of Angel's Rest Chapel ceased to be merely timber and stone. They became an extension of the family's will, an instrument of fear and control, capable of erasing lives without leaving evidence, rewriting reality in real time. And as the surviving sisters moved through the halls, they could feel the invisible strings tightening around them, each step a reminder that the sanctuary they had believed in was never real, that every act of mercy and kindness they had known in this place had been a carefully calculated trap, and that their own identities, their sense of moral purpose, were now under assault in a war they had not agreed to fight and could barely comprehend. As the days blurred into nights at Angel's Rest Chapel, the surviving Selkirk sisters found themselves sinking deeper into a nightmare that had no visible end, a relentless descent orchestrated with the precision of masterful cruelty. Every routine was infused with subtle terror, Meals served with smiles that hinted at consequences, prayers that reinforced submission, and casual remarks that reminded them that nothing, not even their intentions, existed outside the family's control. Miriam's presence was a constant, comforting, yet suffocating, as if every glance measured their thoughts, every word gauged their loyalties. Cain and Abel continued their invisible work, spinning narratives that turned reality against perception, convincing the sisters that the outside world was either complicit or incapable of helping them. That escape was not only impossible, but morally fraught. The children, innocent yet indoctrinated, reflected the family's influence in small gestures, whispered warnings, and obedient compliance, each interaction serving as a reinforcement of the system that had trapped them all. Beneath the chapel, Sarif honed the orchestration of terror, ensuring that every disappearance was not only efficient, but psychologically devastating, prolonging awareness, just enough to induce paralyzing fear in both those taken and those who remained. The sisters began to experience the slow unspooling of their own identities, moments of doubt creeping into thought, twisting conviction into hesitation, compassion into despair. Sleep became shallow and filled with dreams that mirrored the horrors above and below, dreams that seemed to predict which rooms would echo with silence next, which child or caretaker would vanish in the pretense of safety. Even the air, heavy with the musk of the swamp and the faint tang of decay, seemed to conspire, pressing in on their senses, reminding them constantly that the walls themselves were extensions of the Whitworth will. By the end of the first week, the sisters' spirits were fragmented. Fear and learned helplessness had replaced certainty, and every action was now measured against invisible consequences. They were no longer guiding the children. They were being guided, herded, shaped, broken in a slow, deliberate process that the Whitworths had perfected over decades. And yet, despite the mounting terror, a flicker of resistance remained, fragile but stubborn, a spark that refused full extinguishment. It was this spark that the family recognized, the piece of human unpredictability that demanded more elaborate measures, more psychological pressure, and more subtle manipulations, ensuring that the descent into darkness would continue inexorably, that each passing hour would tighten the chains of obedience, and that the Selkirk sisters, though still alive, were already losing the very essence of themselves, becoming extensions of the Whitworth system, their humanity slowly consumed in a machine designed to erase hope without ever leaving a trace. The Whitworths, having sensed the faint but persistent spark of resistance in the Selkirk sisters, escalated their methods, turning subtle intimidation into a deliberate campaign of psychological warfare designed to crush identity and will. They began introducing contradictions and uncertainties into the sisters' daily reality, messages whispered through the children, instructions from Miriam that seemed kind but carried hidden threats, and fabricated events orchestrated by Cain and Abel that made the sisters question their memory, their judgment, and even their own senses. Every attempt to reason or intervene was met with a carefully calibrated response. Small punishments masked as lessons in obedience, demonstrations of power that left no visible scars, but etched terror into the mind. Nights became the most dangerous hours when the basement's hidden cells, already instruments of fear, were used to isolate, disorient, and intimidate, forcing the sisters to witness disappearances through glimpses and muffled sounds, a methodical breaking of spirit without the release of complete knowledge, leaving dread to fill every unanswered question. Sarif's presence below was both terrifying and clinical, his knowledge of anatomy and psychology creating experiences that lingered in the mind long after the moment passed, imprinting fear, dependency, and confusion. The sisters, once confident and compassionate, began to fracture under the relentless pressure, their thoughts twisting around the impossible morality of their situation. To survive, they had to comply, yet compliance felt like complicity, and complicity, a sin against everything they had once stood for. Even the children, now semi-instruments of the Whitworth design, mirrored this controlled chaos, their behavior reinforcing the sisters' sense of helplessness, leaving them isolated in a hall of mirrors where every reflected yen was a reminder of what could be lost. By the end of this escalation, the first real psychological breaking occurred. One sister, haunted by the echoes of vanished children and her missing companion, began to accept the false narrative spun by the family, internalizing obedience and fear as virtue, a transformation the Whitworths had engineered with terrifying precision. It was in that surrender, in the quiet collapse of moral certainty, that the family demonstrated the full power of their methods, not through brute force alone, but through careful, relentless erosion of mind and soul, creating victims whose minds and hearts were already partly theirs, even before the body followed. And as the remaining sisters watched, powerless yet knowing the inevitability of what awaited them, the chilling reality settled. Angel's Rest Chapel was not merely a site of crime. It was a machine for domination, and anyone who entered its walls, no matter how noble or well-intentioned, would be transformed, broken, or erased, leaving behind only questions, whispers, and shadows that history would never fully illuminate. The first complete disappearance of a Selkirk sister occurred with a quiet inevitability that left the remaining sisters paralyzed in a mixture of horror and disbelief, a chilling demonstration of the Whitworths' absolute control. It happened during what had been presented as a routine evening, children tucked into their beds, prayers recited, and the sisters believing they were performing acts of care and comfort. But the atmosphere was laden with unseen intent. Miriam, her voice soft and comforting, guided the sister under the pretense of checking on a child who had feigned illness, while Cain and Abel orchestrated distractions in adjacent rooms, subtle manipulations that drew attention away from the act of abduction. As the sister followed, trusting the familiar face, the door closed behind her, a faint click that resonated like a death knell in the minds of those left behind. In the hidden basement below, Serif waited with the meticulous precision of a surgeon, a master of both anatomy and psychological terror, ensuring the disappearance was not only effective but also a tool to deepen fear in those still present. The remaining sisters, sensing the shift immediately, felt an oppressive weight descend, the first true taste of helplessness settling into their bones. The children, confused and frightened, mirrored the tension, their innocence weaponized, amplifying the sisters' anxiety, while the walls themselves seemed to press inward, a physical reminder of the inescapable power exerted by the family above and below. This disappearance was more than a physical act. It was a psychological statement. Compliance was necessary, resistance was futile, and the machinery of Angel's Rest was relentless, precise, and invisible to the outside world. By the time the day ended, the surviving sisters had begun to unravel, each questioning their judgment, their morality, their ability, tied to protect the children and even their own sense of reality. Fear became an omnipresent teacher, guiding every thought, every step, every decision. And in that oppressive silence, the sisters understood the terrible truth. Angel's Rest Chapel was a crucible, designed to extract obedience through terror, and any notion of sanctuary, of rescue, of moral righteousness was a lie meticulously maintained by the Whitworths, leaving those trapped within the chapel's walls to navigate a new existence defined not by compassion or agency, but by the unrelenting, invisible dominion of calculated, centuries-deep evil. With one sister vanished, and the echoes of her absence reverberating through the halls, the remaining Selkirk sisters entered a state of relentless psychological erosion, each day designed to further strip away their sense of self and warp their perception of reality. Miriam moved with deliberate grace, her charm now a weapon honed to perfection, coaxing obedience through warmth while subtly instilling doubt, guilt, and fear, teaching the sisters that even thoughts of resistance were morally flawed. Cain and Abel intensified their manipulations, creating scenarios that made the sisters question not only their memory, but the reliability of the children themselves. Small misbehaviors, whispered lies, and staged accidents trained the young ones to serve as extensions of the Whitworth control, reflecting terror back onto the sisters in ways that felt inevitable and inescapable. Serif's influence below ground grew more insidious, his knowledge of human anatomy and mental fragility allowing him to impose suffering that lingered long after the moment passed, creating invisible scars in the minds of those who observed or heard the faintest traces of his methods. The sisters, once confident and capable, found themselves second-guessing every action. A kind gesture could now be interpreted as a moral failure. An attempt to comfort a child might invite reprimand or punishment. And every door, every corridor, every shadow seemed to carry the weight of unseen observation. Sleep became fragmented, filled with recurring images of vanished companions and distorted versions of the children they sought to protect, dreams that left waking fear embedded in their consciousness. They began to realize that the chapel itself, with its carefully constructed architecture and concealed spaces, was not merely a building, but a calculated extension of the Whitworth's will, a tool for breaking resist, and enforcing obedience through environment as much as through interaction. By now, terror had transformed into a constant, gnawing companion, shaping decisions, bending morality, and eroding courage. The sisters were becoming part of the system they had entered to resist, their compassion weaponized against them, their authority undermined, and their identities absorbed into the machinery of manipulation. The chilling understanding settled in. Angel's Rest Chapel was not only a site of physical disappearance, but a crucible of psychological domination, and every heartbeat within its walls was being catalogued, measured, and manipulated, ensuring that those who remained were neither free nor innocent, but already tethered to the will of the Whitworths, walking a path toward inevitable compliance or vanishing entirely into the shadows of the family's meticulously orchestrated evil. As the Selkirk sisters' resistance eroded under the relentless psychological onslaught, the Whitworths escalated their methods, now using the children as instruments of fear and control in ways both subtle and devastating. Every act of obedience from the youngsters was monitored and rewarded with attention. Every misstep observed and amplified to instill anxiety in the sisters, creating a feedback loop where care and discipline became indistinguishable from manipulation. Miriam's presence was omnipresent, a serene and terrifying reminder that every word, every glance, every gesture carried consequences, teaching the sisters that even small deviations from compliance could ripple outward with unforeseen results. Cain and Abel orchestrated scenarios in which the children unwittingly betrayed the sisters' intentions or revealed confidences, their innocence weaponized to amplify guilt and despair, reinforcing the lesson that no action, no thought, no expression existed outside the family's scrutiny. Below, Serif continued his methodical work, using anatomy and psychological insight to extract maximum terror from the disappeared, ensuring that even those above ground were haunted by faint sounds, subtle movements, and the unsettling knowledge that the unseen horrors below were always present. The sisters' sleep became tormented by recurring nightmares, visions of vanished companions, twisted versions of children they sought to protect, and faint, echoing cries from the basement that blurred the line between dream and reality, each night further weakening their minds, their resolve, their very sense of identity. By now, the walls, corridors, and hidden spaces of the chapel were more than architecture. They were extensions of the Whitworth's will, carefully engineered to disorient, isolate, and dominate. Every attempt at leadership, every effort to protect the children or preserve the morality was met with subtle resistance, calculated setbacks, or psychological traps, teaching the sisters that survival required not heroism, but submission. Slowly, despair and learned helplessness became their constant companions, their moral compass warped by fear and confusion, while the remaining children, trained unknowingly in the family's logic, mirrored this corruption back to them. Angel's Rest chapel had transformed fully into a crucible of domination, a place where innocence was weaponized, resistance punished silently but decisively, and every living presence was being methodically rewritten into the narrative of control, a reality from which there would be no simple escape, only the slow, deliberate absorption into the machinery of the Whitworths' meticulously perfected terror. By now, the Selkirk sisters, though battered and manipulated, began to test the boundaries of the Whitworths' control, attempting subtle acts of defiance, whispered questions to the children, small attempts to hide knowledge, fleeting glances toward exits. But every gesture, no matter how minor, was immediately noted, catalogued, and countered with precision. Miriam's gentle guidance became a scalpel, dissecting their intentions with pointed questions, carefully worded remarks, and moments of praise that made the sisters doubt whether their own thoughts were treacherous or merely misguided. Cain and Abel intensified their psychological orchestration, planting false memories, staging scenarios where compliance appeared morally wrong, and using the children as mirrors that reflected fear and guilt back onto the sisters, reinforcing the lesson that resistance carried invisible but unavoidable consequences. Below the chapel, Serif refined his methods, manipulating both perception and circumstance so that even rumors of disappearances became tools of psychological terror, ensuring that the sisters could never be certain which threats were real and which were orchestrated illusions. The sisters' sleep became a battlefield of distorted dreams and half-remembered screams, their waking hours filled with subtle cues designed to undermine confidence, fracture morality, and normalize fear as a guiding principle. Each attempt at kindness toward the children, each effort to maintain their own ethical framework, was met with small but insidious punishments, misplaced objects, whispered lies, and the eerie absence of companions, creating a creeping paranoia that infected every thought and every decision. Slowly, the chapel itself seemed to close in, its walls no longer neutral architecture, but a living extension of the family's will, observing, judging, and directing each step. The sisters' identities began to blur under this relentless pressure. They could no longer distinguish between their own moral instincts and the imposed logic of the Whitworths, a transformation as invisible as it was complete. Even moments of clarity, brief flashes of self-awareness or strategy, were destabilized immediately, leaving them caught in a perpetual state of confusion, doubt, and fear. In this stage of the operation, Angel's Rest Chapel had become more than a prison or a site of abduction. It was a laboratory of domination, a meticulously controlled ecosystem where thought, action, and morality were continuously measured, manipulated, and rewritten, ensuring that survival required surrender, and that any spark of rebellion, however small, could be extinguished before it grew, leaving the sisters trapped in a world where the very essence of freedom, identity, and hope was being methodically erased. The relentless pressure began to fracture the Selkirk sisters in ways both visible and insidious, their minds bending under a weight that was at once psychological, moral, and existential, a force carefully calibrated by the Whitworths to extract compliance and erase resistance. Subtle changes appeared first: hesitation in speech, moments of doubt when making decisions, the creeping inability to trust their own instincts. But soon these shifts became more profound. One sister began to avoid eye contact with the children, fearful that any misstep might trigger reprisal. Another found herself second-guessing moral judgments, wondering if mercy could be interpreted as weakness. And a third, haunted by the disappearances, began whispering quietly in the dark, rehearsing apologies for sins she had never committed. Miriam, Cain, and Abel observed each fissure like surgeons, noting which weaknesses could be exploited, which fears could be amplified, and which small acts of rebellion could be transformed into lessons in obedience. The children, now semi-trained instruments of the Whitworth system, absorbed these fractures and reflected them back in subtle ways: furtive glances, whispered confessions, small betrayals that reinforced the sisters' growing anxiety and guilt. Serif's interventions in the basement continued to echo through the sisters' consciousness, even when no direct evidence of suffering was present, a phantom terror that demonstrated the family's reach and power. The chapel, its walls thick with centuries of careful design, seemed to pulse with a malevolent intelligence, turning ordinary sounds, a door creak, a footstep, the faint rustle of moss outside, into reminders that nothing in this space existed outside the control of the Whitworths. Slowly, the sisters began to internalize the lessons being forced upon them. That authority was absolute, that defiance brought ruin, that every instinct of protection or moral judgment could be weaponized against them, and that their very sense of self was a commodity to be molded, measured, and repurposed. Fear and obedience intertwined so completely that moments of courage were immediately suffocated, replaced by caution, compliance, and resignation. In this stage, Angel's Rest Chapel was no longer a physical space, but a living system of control, where every thought, emotion, and interaction was observed, analyzed, and manipulated. The sisters were caught in a relentless spiral, their identities bending to the will of the Whitworths, their humanity gradually transformed into instruments of submission, and the children, once innocent, now acting as extensions of the family's dominion, reinforcing the suffocating cycle that ensured no spark of rebellion would survive unscathed. The Whitworths, recognizing that fear alone could no longer fully control the Selkirk sisters, began to engineer conflicts among them, a masterstroke of psychological manipulation that transformed camaraderie into suspicion and solidarity into fracture. Subtle insinuations, carefully timed remarks, and manipulated observations made it appear that one sister was careless, another disloyal, another harboring secrets that could imperil all. Miriam, her smile serene, whispered counsel that seemed benign but carried the weight of accusation. Cain and Abel staged situations where the sisters' actions could be misinterpreted, crafting a sense of betrayal and moral compromise that slowly eroded trust. The children, now active participants, mirrored these dynamics, reflecting perceived favoritism or disapproval, amplifying tension, and further isolating the sisters from one another. Serif's subterranean influence continued to permeate their consciousness, ensuring that every absence, every muffled sound, every whispered echo from the basement reinforced paranoia, guilt, and doubt, leaving the sisters questioning not only their choices, but their perceptions of reality itself. Sleep became more fragmented, invaded by recurring nightmares in which the missing sisters appeared, twisted and distorted, accusing them of complicity or cowardice, while waking moments were filled with the weight of impossible decisions. A gentle reprimand could be construed as defiance, a whispered kindness toward a child as weakness, a fleeting thought of resistance as folly. The chapel itself seemed complicit, its walls designed to amplify small sounds, distort perception, and create the unshakable sense that one was never alone, never free, and never beyond scrutiny. Slowly, the sisters' collective identity disintegrated into isolated minds, each battling fear, guilt, and internalized suspicion. Adines, Amick the Whitworths had perfected over decades of observation and cruelty. Even moments of tenderness or moral clarity were short-lived, quickly replaced by hesitation, doubt, and the creeping recognition that any misstep, perceived or real, could trigger consequences both immediate and invisible. Angel's Rest Chapel had become a living crucible, where obedience was forced not only through terror, but through the deliberate dismantling of trust, identity, and solidarity, leaving the sisters isolated, fragile, and fully ensnared in a system that had turned children, architecture, and every nuance of perception into instruments of domination. By the end of this stage, the sisters were no longer merely captives. They were participants in their own subjugation, their humanity gradually subsumed into the calculated, terrifying design of the Whitworths, and the cycle of manipulation, fear, and obedience had become an unbroken, inescapable reality. The first of the Selkirk sisters finally succumbed to the unrelenting psychological and emotional torment. Her collapse, a devastating yet meticulously orchestrated moment that the Whitworths had been preparing for from the very beginning. It began subtly. Missed meals, tremors of indecision, whispered confessions of fear and guilt, each a breadcrumb that led her closer to total surrender. Miriam's presence, once a seeming source of guidance, became the catalyst of her undoing, a constant, suffocating reminder that every thought, every hesitation was observed, measured, and judged. Cain and Abel amplified the pressure, orchestrating minor failures with the children, planting seeds of doubt, and creating scenarios where even compassionate impulses seemed dangerous or morally corrupt, forcing the sister to question her very instincts. Serif's influence, though unseen, was omnipresent. Faint sounds, subtle manipulations of timing and environment, and the ghostly echoes of the basement reminded her that there was no place beyond observation, no moment free from the family's control. Her breakdown was as much psychological as it was emotional. She began to internalize obedience as necessity, fear as morality, and submission as virtue, slowly reshaping her identity to align with the calculated demands of the Whitworths. The remaining sisters watched in horrified silence, both witnesses to the precision of the family's methods and fearful of the inevitable continuation of the same fate for themselves. Every act of defiance they had attempted now felt not only futile, but dangerous, their previous strategies reduced to illusions of control, their attempts to protect the children compromised by the new understanding that resistance came with consequences too precise and pervasive to escape. Angel's Rest. Chapel, its walls soaked in centuries of calculated domination, seemed almost set alive in its orchestration, amplifying fear, distorting perception, and enforcing the invisible rules of submission that bound every living soul within it. The children, now more aware of the stakes and trained to mirror authority, acted as constant reinforcements of the sisters' fractured psyche, ensuring that even empathy became an instrument of control. By the end of this collapse, the first sister was effectively transformed into an extension of the Whitworth system, obedient, fearful, and compliant, and the remaining sisters understood with chilling clarity that their own survival demanded not only submission but complicity, that every instinct of resistance or compassion would be turned against them, and that the machinery of Angel's Rest Chapel had proven itself not only capable of breaking a single human mind, but of systematically rewriting it to serve the unyielding, invisible will of the Whitworth family. With the first sister fully broken and absorbed into the machinery of control, the remaining Selkirk sisters were forced into an unbearable new reality. Survival now required active participation in the very system that had destroyed their companion. Every interaction with the children, every task within the chapel, every whispered conversation became a test of obedience and a lesson in moral corruption, as Miriam and the twins guided them into behaviors that blurred the lines between victim and instrument. Cain and Abel orchestrated scenarios that made the sisters both observers and enforcers of fear, compelling them to witness the suffering of others, to make decisions that directly influenced who would endure pain and who would vanish next, while subtle manipulations ensured that refusal was impossible without immediate and devastating consequences. Serif's influence, though physically distant, continued to permeate every corner of their perception. Muffled sounds from the basement, faint echoes of torment, and carefully timed disruptions of daily routine reinforced the inescapable presence of authority, cementing the understanding that control extended beyond sight and touch, infiltrating the very mind. Slowly, the sisters' moral compass was bent, then rewritten, as the act of participation became normalized, a coping mechanism disguised as survival, their identities increasingly tethered to the architecture of fear that the Whitworths had perfected over decades. Even fleeting moments of empathy were weaponized. Comforting a child or questioning an order became exercises in guilt, ensuring that conscience itself became a tool of compliance. Angel's Rest. Chapel, with its concealed passageways, soundproofed cells, and labyrinthine design, had transformed fully into a living instrument of domination, each room and corridor a psychological trap calibrated to enforce obedience, fracture solidarity, and amplify despair. By now, the sisters were no longer merely victims. They were intermediaries of the system, their hands, hearts, and minds co-opted to reinforce the very terror that had once imprisoned them. Fear had become instinct, morality a question of survival, and identity a malleable construct under the relentless orchestration of the Whitworths. In this stage, the chapel had completed its metamorphosis into a crucible of corruption, turning innocence, courage, and compassion into instruments of control, ensuring that those who remained were not only contained but fully complicit in the perpetuation of a darkness that could, once unleashed, spread further than any of them could imagine. Amid the suffocating domination and meticulously engineered obedience, faint cracks began to emerge within the Whitworth system, imperceptible at first, but enough to ignite the fragile embers of defiance in the remaining Selkirk sisters. Small inconsistencies, a glance exchanged between children, a hesitation in Miriam's otherwise flawless control, a whispered error in Cain and Abel's staged scenarios, offered the sisters fleeting glimpses of possibility, reminders that the machinery of fear, though formidable, was not omnipotent. These moments, though brief, became precious, sparking silent calculations in the sisters' minds. How could they exploit a lapse? How could they shield a child without triggering immediate reprisal? And perhaps most dangerously, could they begin to manipulate the manipulators? Serif's omnipresent influence, while terrifying, revealed subtle patterns in timing, response, and oversight that hinted at limitations, allowing the sisters to test boundaries with minute acts of courage, delayed responses, feigned compliance, hidden gestures of comfort toward the children. The children themselves, conditioned to mimic authority and reflect terror, inadvertently contributed to these small rebellions through untrained responses, miscommunications, or innocent questions that exposed the gaps in the Whitworths' perfect orchestration. Within the oppressive walls of Angel's Rest Chapel, these minor fissures ignited a dangerous, exhilarating tension. The sisters' minds, once fully tethered to fear, began to oscillate between compliance and subtle subversion, balancing survival against the first sparks of moral agency they had felt in months. Every movement now carried a dual purpose: obedience to maintain safety and covert observation to exploit weakness, turning daily routines into a silent war of wills, each act loaded with risk, strategy, and consequence. The chapel, though still a living crucible of terror, revealed its first vulnerabilities. The sisters learned to read its rhythm, to anticipate patterns in supervision, and to sense where control might falter, even momentarily. In this stage, the once unassailable psychological fortress began to show the faintest signs of cracks, and with those cracks came possibility, a dangerous knowledge that the system, for all its precision, was neither absolute nor eternal. Fear remained omnipresent, obedience a necessity, but the first seeds of resistance, small, cautious, and perilous, had taken root, promising that the narrative of domination might one day be challenged from within, and that the Whitworths' meticulously maintained empire of control could be tested in ways they had never anticipated. The Selkirk sisters, emboldened by the faint cracks they had detected in the Whitworth system, began to orchestrate subtle acts of sabotage, each movement calculated to destabilize authority while minimizing the risk of immediate reprisal. Small manipulations, misplaced objects, delayed responses, whispered redirections to the children, tiny inconsistencies in reported observations, created ripples of confusion that, though nearly imperceptible to Miriam, Cain, and Abel, were enough to seed uncertainty and hesitation within the otherwise flawless chain of control. The sisters moved with extreme caution, reading the rhythms of supervision, tracking Seraph's unseen influence through patterns of noise, timing, and the reactions of both children and adults, exploiting each micro-flaw to test boundaries and gather information about weaknesses in the family's orchestration. The children, still partially conditioned to mirror fear, became unwitting allies in this silent rebellion, their innocent errors and untrained responses offering openings that the sisters could leverage to shield themselves, protect one another, and preserve moments of moral clarity. Angel's Rest. Chapel, still oppressive and meticulously designed to dominate, now became a chessboard, each corridor, hidden doorway, and passageway a potential conduit for subtle subversion, each shadow a place to observe, calculate, and plan. The sisters' psychological transformation accelerated, blending learned fear with tactical cunning. They understood now that survival required not only compliance, but strategic deception, moral compromise, and a keen awareness of every nuance of the Whitworths' methods. Sleep remained fitful and haunted by echoes from the basement, but even in dreams, they rehearsed strategies, memorized patterns, and plotted interventions that could delay or disrupt the family's control. The tension bet. Wean obedience and resistance created a constant mental calculus, forcing the sisters to weigh every action, every word, and every gesture against potential consequences while steadily reclaiming fragments of agency. In this delicate balance, fear remained a potent tool wielded by the Whitworths, but the first deliberate acts of defiance, invisible yet persistent, signaled that the architecture of domination was not invulnerable, that even within the suffocating walls of Angel's Rest Chapel, resilience, cunning, and careful subversion could plant the seeds of a deeper upheaval, threatening to challenge the very foundations of a meticulously maintained empire of terror. As the Selkirk sisters' confidence in their subtle rebellion grew, they began to extend their influence to the children, recognizing that these young witnesses and participants were both a vulnerability in the Whitworth system and a potential leverage point. Carefully, almost imperceptibly, they introduced concepts of choice, morality, and observation, encouraging the children to question the absolute authority of Miriam, Cain, and Abel without ever openly defying them, turning curiosity into a quiet form of resistance. Each whispered lesson, each moment of covert guidance was layered with caution, for a single misstep could expose their intentions and provoke immediate, brutal correction. The children's responses, a mixture of obedience and instinctual insight, created subtle disruptions in the calculated patterns of the Whitworths, moments where the sisters could observe cracks in control, gaps in attention, and vulnerabilities in surveillance. Angel's Rest Chapel, still an imposing labyrinth of fear, soundproofed cells, and shadowed corridors, became a stage for this intricate psychological dance, where each gesture, glance, and interaction carried dual meanings: outward compliance for safety, inward subversion for survival. Seraph's omnipresent influence, though terrifying, had predictable rhythms, and the sisters exploited these patterns to orchestrate minor misdirections, protect moments of moral clarity, and gradually expand their sphere of quiet rebellion. Sleep remained fragmented by haunting echoes of the basement, but in these restless hours they rehearsed strategies, memorized routines, and planned interventions that balanced the risk of discovery with the imperative of moral preservation. The sisters themselves were evolving. Fear no longer dictated every thought, but calculated caution tempered with subtle assertiveness. Moral reasoning navigated through all layers of deception, and empathy transformed into a tool for strategic influence. Through this careful cultivation of insight and agency, they began to turn the very instruments of oppression, the children, the architecture, the rhythms of supervision, against the Whitworths, planting seeds of confusion, hesitation, and moral questioning that, if nurtured, could ultimately undermine the meticulously maintained empire of terror. The chapel's walls, though still suffused with centuries of cruelty, now echoed not only with fear, but with the nascent potential for defiance, a silent tension that promised the first true opportunity to destabilize a system that had once seemed absolute and unassailable. Emboldened by the subtle successes of their quiet subversions, the Selkirk sisters orchestrated their first deliberate act of sabotage, a calculated disruption designed to test the limits of the Whitworths' control and to gauge the reactions of both the adults and the children under their manipulation. They manipulated the timing of the chapel's daily routines, creating small but disorienting delays in the preparation of meals, the arrangement of cells, and the reporting of observations, so that Miriam, Cain, and Abel were forced to confront discrepancies they could neither ignore nor immediately correct. These minor but precise disruptions produced ripples of confusion and frustration, revealing weaknesses in oversight, gaps in communication, and the potential for greater strategic influence. The children, now subtly trained to perceive and reflect these disturbances, acted as unwitting amplifiers of the sisters' actions. A hesitant glance, a delayed obedience, or an innocent misstep added layers of unpredictability that challenged the Whitworths' meticulously rehearsed routines. Serif's subterranean influence remained terrifyingly constant, yet the sisters had begun to anticipate patterns in his interventions, exploiting brief moments when his attention was divided to execute acts of resistance with minimal risk. Within the walls of Angel's Rest Chapel, the sisters' tactical ingenuity transformed every corridor, cell, and shadowed corner into instruments of psychological leverage, converting fear into a tool for covert strategy. Their moral calculus became increasingly sophisticated. Every act of sabotage had to balance the preservation of life, the maintenance of trust with the children, and the extraction of intelligence about the family's weaknesses, all while ensuring that the veneer of obedience remained convincing enough to avoid immediate retaliation. The first, deliberate disruption was small, almost imperceptible to anyone outside the chapel, yet it marked a critical turning point. The sisters were no longer passive victims, nor merely participants in a cycle of oppression. They had become active agents within the system, capable of shaping, manipulating, and subtly undermining the very structures that had sought to consume them. Fear still reigned supreme, but now it was counterbalanced by strategy, awareness, and the dangerous exhilaration of agency, signaling the opening of a new, high-stakes chapter in the psychological war unfolding within the oppressive, labyrinthine walls of Angel's Rest Chapel. The Whitworths, long accustomed to absolute obedience and meticulously engineered fear, began to detect anomalies in the chapel's routines, subtle disturbances that hinted at deliberate interference, and the response was swift, precise, and chilling. Miriam, Cain, and Abel intensified surveillance, observing not only the Selkirk sisters, but every movement of the children, recalibrating patterns of control to eliminate even the slightest hint of unpredictability. Serif, with his uncanny knowledge of anatomy and psychological manipulation, implemented additional methods to enforce compliance: new auditory cues, carefully timed shadows, and modifications to the basement's soundproofing that magnified even the faintest expressions of dissent. The sisters, now fully aware that their actions had been noticed, entered a perilous phase of resistance, balancing ingenuity with extreme caution, knowing that any misstep could provoke immediate and brutal retaliation. Yet within this heightened pressure, they discovered opportunities for deeper subversion. The Whitworths' overcorrection created gaps elsewhere, distractions in the system that could be exploited for communication, protection of the children, and the extraction of vital information about the family's routines, weaknesses, and psychological dependencies. The children, increasingly perceptive, mirrored these disturbances, occasionally revealing cracks in authority that the sisters could exploit, turning fear into a vehicle for subtle influence and teaching them the first lessons in cautious moral agency. Angel's Rest Chapel, once a perfect instrument of domination, now functioned as a complex battlefield of observation, strategy, and counter-strategy, where every corridor, cell, and shadow was a theater of psychological warfare. The sisters' identity continued to evolve. Fear remained a constant companion, but it was tempered by acute awareness, tactical reasoning, and the deliberate cultivation of unpredictability, allowing them to navigate an environment designed for total subjugation with increasing effectiveness. Each day became a high-stakes exercise in deception, observation, and moral compromise, a relentless negotiation between survival, ethical integrity, and strategic advantage, forcing the Whitworths to contend with an adaptive, intelligent resistance within their carefully controlled empire. In this tense dynamic, the chapel's walls now bore witness not only to terror, but to the first true signs that the meticulously maintained system of oppression could be challenged, subtly undermined, and, in time, perhaps unmade from within, signaling a dangerous escalation in the hidden war of control and resistance. With the Whitworths' heightened vigilance forcing the Selkirk sisters to operate with unprecedented caution, they began to develop covert methods of communication, subtle gestures, and encrypted signals that allowed them to coordinate without detection, transforming whispered alliances into a fragile network of resistance. Every glance, every positioning of an object, and every seemingly innocuous phrase became loaded with meaning, enabling the sisters to share intelligence about the family's routines, surveillance patterns, and the reactions of the children under extreme scrutiny. The children, carefully guided and observed, began to participate in this covert system, learning to relay messages, conceal minor acts of defiance, and recognize opportunities to disrupt authority without immediate consequence. Angel's Rest. Chapel, designed for omnipotent control, was now infiltrated by invisible currents of strategy, misdirection, and moral subversion, turning spaces of terror into channels of clandestine communication. Miriam, Cain, and Abel remained formidable, but their overconfidence in the perfection of the system made them blind to the ingenuity unfolding beneath their watchful eyes. Even Serif's precise influence could not entirely prevent the sisters from exploiting the subtle gaps created by human error, distraction, or fatigue. The sisters' psychological evolution accelerated under these conditions. Fear became a measured instrument rather than a paralyzing force. Moral judgment was exercised with calculated caution, and every action was doubly coded to maintain the appearance of compliance while advancing the hidden agenda of survival and subversion. Small victories, messages successfully relayed, minor disruptions unnoticed, children subtly encouraged to think independently, imbued them with a dangerous confidence, teaching that even in the most tightly controlled environment, intelligence, patience, and cunning could create leverage. Each success reinforced the idea that the system, for all its terror and precision, was not infallible, and that control was a fragile construct maintained only by perception, fear, and the manipulation of human weakness. Within the oppressive architecture of the chapel, a new kind of power emerged, one not rooted in domination, but in careful observation, moral agility, and the strategic orchestration of subtle defiance, signaling that the Selkirk sisters, though still deeply ensnared, were beginning to reclaim agency in a war waged as much in the mind as in the corridors and shadowed spaces of Angel's Rest. Emboldened by their clandestine network of communication, the Selkirk sisters escalated their efforts into coordinated acts that directly disrupted the Whitworths' operations, testing both their own limits and the vulnerabilities of the system that had once seemed unassailable. Minor errors were amplified into critical delays. Meals arrived late, documentation was subtly altered, and the arrangement of the children and prisoners was manipulated to sow confusion in the daily routines that Miriam, Cain, and Abel had perfected. Each act required precise timing, an acute understanding of the Whitworths' expectations, and careful monitoring of reactions to ensure that the consequences did not escalate into immediate violence. The children, now adept in the sisters' subtle code, became extensions of this resistance, carrying out simple interventions that created cascading disruptions, from misdirecting attention to creating opportunities for the sisters to shield prisoners or conceal evidence of interference. Angel's Rest. Chapel, a space meticulously engineered for domination and surveillance, now functioned as a stage for psychological and operational sabotage, where every corridor, hidden door, and soundproofed cell could be leveraged as a tool for subversion. Seraph, despite his knowledge of anatomy and control over the basement, found his influence challenged by these unpredictable interventions, while Miriam, Cain, and Abel faced the growing strain of reconciling their perception of perfect obedience with the small, inexplicable failures that accumulated like sparks in a dry forest. The sisters' psychological transformation continued to accelerate under this high-stakes pressure. Fear was honed into vigilance, moral reasoning became strategic, and each act of resistance reinforced the dangerous realization that the empire of terror was not immutable, that even within the oppressive, shadowed walls of Angel's Rest, human ingenuity, patience, and courage could carve cracks into a system designed to eliminate them. With each successful disruption, they deepened their understanding of the Whitworth's patterns, weaknesses, and blind spots, gaining insight into how terror was maintained and how it could be subtly undermined. In this perilous game of observation and action, the chapel became both prison and battlefield. Fear and strategy intertwined, and the Selkirk sisters began to taste the intoxicating possibility that despite centuries of cruelty embedded in its foundations, the system of control might one day bend to the will of those who had been most oppressed, signaling a new phase of psychological warfare and calculated rebellion. The Whitworths, long accustomed to absolute obedience and the seamless execution of terror, began to show signs of unease as the Selkirk sisters' coordinated sabotage penetrated deeper into the fabric of their operations, revealing vulnerabilities that had never before been tested. Small discrepancies, missed instructions, delayed reports, misaligned schedules accumulated into a pattern that the family could no longer ignore, forcing Miriam, Cain, and Abel to confront the dissonance between the flawless order they demanded and the reality of subtle resistance unfolding beneath their watchful eyes. Even Seraph, whose knowledge of anatomy and psychological control had rendered him seemingly untouchable, faced the strain of unpredictable disruptions, realizing that his precise calculations could be challenged by ingenuity, observation, and the disciplined patience of those he had assumed powerless. Within Angel's Rest Chapel, tension mounted as the sisters expanded their influence over the children, guiding them to recognize inconsistencies and act in ways that amplified the chaos while remaining imperceptible to immediate detection, turning the youngest witnesses into instruments of resistance and expanding the sphere of defiance without drawing fatal attention. The family's authority, once unassailable and absolute, began to fracture in subtle ways. Whispered disagreements between siblings over the interpretation of disruptions, tension in coordinating surveillance, and the creeping realization that control was not inherent but enforced, dependent on perception, fear, and the cooperation of those who had long been regarded as obedient subjects. The Selkirk sisters, now fully adept at exploiting these fissures, moved with precision, balancing risk with impact, ensuring that each act of defiance both preserved survival and eroded the illusion of omnipotence that had sustained the Whitworths for decades. Fear remained pervasive, yet it was now countered by calculated courage, strategic reasoning, and a dangerous awareness that the empire of terror, for all its meticulous design, was vulnerable to persistence, intelligence, and the subtle cultivation of moral agency. Every shadowed corridor, soundproofed cell, and hidden passage became both a tool and a test, a stage on which the delicate equilibrium of control and resistance played out, signaling that the once perfect machinery of domination had entered a state of instability, where even the smallest act of rebellion could ripple outward, sowing doubt, tension, and the first true fractures in an empire that had thrived on absolute obedience and relentless fear. The Selkirk sisters, emboldened by the subtle cracks they had engineered, began to provoke direct confrontations, testing the Whitworths' reactions while carefully calibrating every move to avoid catastrophic reprisal. Minor acts of defiance, questions phrased to expose inconsistencies, slight misalignments in obedience, or strategic delays in completing tasks, forced Miriam, Cain, and Abel to respond in real time, revealing the emotional and procedural limits of their control. The children, now increasingly attuned to the sisters' coded guidance, acted as amplifiers of disruption, their tentative hesitations and carefully placed errors creating tension in the once rigid structure of the chapel's routines, demonstrating that even the youngest instruments of oppression could be repurposed for resistance. Seraph's influence, though still formidable, was tested as he attempted to reassert authority over the basement and maintain the facade of omnipotence. The sisters anticipated his patterns, exploiting his predictable interventions and turning them into opportunities to shield the vulnerable and gather intelligence on the family's vulnerabilities. The atmosphere within Angel's Rest Chapel became charged, a delicate equilibrium of fear, cunning, and latent defiance, where every glance, word, and movement carried dual significance: compliance on the surface, rebellion in intent. The Whitworths' internal cohesion began to strain under these pressures, with siblings questioning each other's interpretations of disturbances, surveillance priorities conflicting, and the invisible veneer of perfection cracking under the weight of uncertainty. The sisters' psychological transformation accelerated further. Fear became strategic awareness, empathy became tactical influence, and moral judgment intertwined with calculated action, allowing them to exploit weaknesses without sacrificing life or exposing their plans prematurely. Every corridor, hidden doorway, and shadowed cell now served as a stage for this escalating psychological warfare, where observation, patience, and precise timing became weapons in a silent campaign against terror itself. In this escalating tension, it became clear that the sisters' presence had shifted the balance of power, demonstrating that even the most meticulously designed system of fear and obedience could be destabilized from within, and that survival, agency, and strategic defiance could coexist in the shadow of an empire long thought unassailable. Building on their growing mastery of the Whitworths' routines and the subtle influence over the children, the Selkirk sisters escalated their sabotage into acts that threatened not just daily operations, but the broader machinery of the family's sinister enterprise, testing the very foundations of control that Gabriel and his progeny had spent decades perfecting. They manipulated supply routes, altered records, and introduced discrepancies in communications with external partners, each carefully measured to provoke confusion without immediate detection. The children, now trained in observation and subtle signaling, became critical allies, executing minor interventions that amplified the sisters' efforts. Misfiled documents, delayed deliveries, and quietly redirected inquiries created cascading disruptions that forced Miriam, Cain, and Abel into reactive patterns, exposing cracks in coordination and revealing the human limitations behind the veneer of omnipotence. Serif, though ever vigilant, struggled to anticipate the sisters' ingenuity, his precise calculations disrupted by unpredictability, while the family's external networks began to sense irregularities, threatening the carefully maintained profits and secrecy of the empire. Within the suffocating architecture of Angel's Rest Chapel, fear remained pervasive, but it was now balanced by cunning, patience, and a dangerous awareness that the sisters were not merely surviving. They were actively shaping the battlefield. Each act of sabotage became a test of moral, psychological, and strategic acuity, forcing the sisters to navigate a delicate calculus of risk and impact, while preserving their cover and safeguarding the children who were now both observers and participants in the silent rebellion. The Whitworths, confronted with anomalies that could not be fully explained, began to fracture internally. Debates over author, IT, interpretation, and corrective measures surfacing in subtle but telling ways, undermining the illusion of perfection. The chapel's walls, once instruments of absolute domination, now echoed with tension, hesitation, and the invisible assertion of agency, signaling that even an empire built on terror and meticulous order could be destabilized from within. In this precarious and high-stakes environment, the Selkirk sisters demonstrated that intelligence, observation, and moral courage could transform fear into leverage, and that the seeds of systemic disruption, once planted, had the potential to grow into a profound and irreversible challenge to an institution long thought inviolable. As the Selkirk sisters' sabotage intensified, the once unshakable confidence of the Whitworths began to erode, giving way to a growing sense of unease and ultimately panic. Miriam, Cain, and Abel, trained for decades to perceive and eliminate threats before they manifested, now found themselves reacting to anomalies they could not immediately explain, each minor disruption compounding into a larger tapestry of uncertainty that gnawed at their authority. Serif, whose precise understanding of anatomy and psychological control had allowed him to dominate every mind and body under his influence, struggled to anticipate the unpredictable ingenuity of the sisters, forcing him into reactive measures that sometimes contradicted the carefully maintained routines of the basement and chapel. The children, subtly empowered by the sisters, acted as extensions of this psychological insurgency, their hesitations, misdirections, and quiet interventions magnifying the sense of disorder and making the adults question the reliability of even their closest enforcers. Within Angel's Rest Chapel, the tension was palpable, each shadowed corridor, soundproofed cell, and hidden doorway becoming a theater for observation, calculation, and misdirection, where fear was no longer the sole tool of control but a variable to be manipulated and exploited. The Whitworths' internal cohesion began to fracture. Disagreements erupted over how to interpret the anomalies, which interventions to prioritize, and how much to punish without destabilizing the delicate facade of authority they had cultivated for decades. The sisters, acutely aware of the shifting power dynamic, continued to push boundaries with calculated precision, ensuring that each act of disruption preserved safety while amplifying the perception of instability, turning the very instruments of oppression into conduits of resistance. Every misstep by the Whitworths, every delayed reaction, and every internal dispute strengthened the sisters' position, demonstrating that even a meticulously designed system of terror was vulnerable to intelligent, patient, and morally guided subversion. In the shadowed halls of Angel's Rest, the balance of power was no longer fixed, and the specter of rebellion, once unimaginable, now hovered as a tangible, invisible force, promising that the empire of fear could be challenged, destabilized, and, in time, undone from within by those brave enough to act with insight, courage, and relentless strategic cunning. With the cracks in the Whitworths' authority becoming increasingly visible, the Selkirk sisters escalated their operations to create tangible consequences, moving beyond psychological disruption into acts that directly threatened the family's control and profits, all while maintaining the guise of obedience. They manipulated records to delay shipments, misdirected messengers, and subtly corrupted the meticulous documentation that had allowed the family to dominate their external networks, forcing Miriam, Cain, and Abel into frantic corrective measures that only amplified the chaos. Serif, usually a master of anticipating human behavior, found himself reacting to patterns he could not fully predict, and even Gabriel's distant oversight was challenged as the cumulative effect of these subtle sabotages began to ripple outward, destabilizing partnerships, straining logistics, and sowing confusion among their professional allies in Charleston, Savannah, and beyond. The children, now fully integrated into the sisters' covert operations, became critical agents of disruption, performing seemingly innocuous tasks that created amplified consequences. A misplaced ledger, a delayed message, or a quietly altered instruction would cascade into missed opportunities, financial losses, and growing frustration for the Whitworths. Within the shadowed architecture of Angel's Rest Chapel, every corridor, hidden passage, and cell was now part of a living battlefield, a space where fear, obedience, and control were contested by strategy, intelligence, and moral courage. The family's cohesion began to unravel as internal blame shifted, disagreements over corrective strategies intensified, and the carefully cultivated illusion of omnipotence eroded under the pressure of invisible, persistent resistance. For the sisters, each successful disruption was a dangerous affirmation of their growing power and agency, demonstrating that fear, while still a potent tool, could be transformed into leverage, observation into influence, and strategic defiance into a form of unseen dominance within a system designed to annihilate autonomy. Angel's Rest, once a monument to absolute control, now vibrated with uncertainty, tension, and the ever-present possibility that one calculated misstep could escalate into systemic collapse, proving that even the most entrenched structures of fear and obedience could be destabilized from within by intelligence, patience, and relentless cunning. As their influence grew, the Selkirk sisters began orchestrating events that placed the Whitworths themselves in immediate jeopardy, shifting from subtle sabotage to actions with life-or-death stakes, carefully testing the limits of the family's reaction and the fragility of their meticulously constructed dominion. They manipulated critical operations, timing the release and concealment of prisoners, subtly interfering with shipments and communications, and exploiting the blind spots in surveillance to create moments of acute vulnerability, forcing the Whitworths to respond under pressure and revealing their reliance on rigid routines that could no longer adapt to intelligent, coordinated disruption. The children, fully indoctrinated into the sisters' methods, played a pivotal role in these maneuvers, performing precise interventions that magnified the sisters' impact, from delaying essential instructions to misplacing critical information, turning minor oversights into cascading consequences that threatened both profit and authority. Serif, Miriam, Cain, and Abel, confronted with anomalies that challenged their assumptions of control, began to experience real fear, tension, and distrust. Their cohesion undermined by disagreements on how to respond, and their confidence shaken as the invisible hand of resistance grew more palpable with each calculated act. Angel's Rest Chapel, once a fortress of terror and absolute obedience, had become a theater of strategic manipulation where every shadow, corridor, and hidden chamber was weaponized by the sisters' intelligence and careful planning, creating a constant, unpredictable pressure that eroded authority from within. Each successful maneuver reinforced the sisters' awareness that fear, while still powerful, could be converted into leverage, that observation and cunning could reshape the dynamics of power, and that moral agency, when exercised with precision and patience, could transform the most oppressive systems into arenas of contestable control. The Whitworths' empire, built over decades on terror, deception, and the systematic elimination of opposition, now confronted a reality in which every assumption could be exploited, every routine disrupted, and every agent of fear transformed into a conduit of resistance, proving that even the most invincible structures of domination could be destabilized from within by a combination of intelligence, courage, and relentless methodical strategy. As the Selkirk sisters' campaigns of subversion intensified, the children under their guidance began to act with increasing independence, their growing awareness and subtle training turning them from passive observers into active agents capable of undermining the Whitworths' control without direct instruction. Each child learned to anticipate routines, recognize vulnerabilities, and exploit small opportunities, from misdirecting supervisors to quietly safeguarding prisoners, creating a multiplying effect that magnified the sisters' influence across every level of the chapel and plantation. Miriam, Cain, Abel, and Serif, once confident in their unchallenged authority, now faced an environment where every decision, every movement, and every assumption could be observed and countered, destabilizing the rigid hierarchy they had maintained through fear, meticulous planning, and psychological manipulation. The sisters' presence had introduced an invisible network of intelligence and resistance that extended into the very heart of the family's operations, transforming Angel's Rest from a fortress of domination into a dynamic battlefield of observation, anticipation, and strategic defiance. Small victories, delayed reports, altered instructions, carefully mismanaged tasks, now compounded with unprecedented speed, forcing the Whitworths to react unpredictably and revealing fissures in their coordination, trust, and perception of omnipotence. Each act of defiance, though subtle, carried an emotional weight, embedding fear, doubt, and the sense of being observed into the consciousness of the oppressors, while simultaneously strengthening the moral and psychological resilience of those who resisted. The sisters' strategic patience allowed them to orchestrate these developments without drawing immediate retribution, teaching the children not only how to survive under oppression, but to bend the instruments of tyranny to their advantage, turning obedience into illusion, fear into leverage, and observation into actionable insight. Angel's Rest. Chapel, designed for absolute control, now resonated with uncertainty, tension, and the quiet, relentless assertion of agency, demonstrating that even the most entrenched systems of cruelty and domination could be destabilized when intelligence, courage, and calculated action converged in the hands of those brave enough to seize the invisible threads of power within the shadows. With the children now acting as extensions of their will, the Selkirk sisters escalated their operations to directly manipulate the Whitworths' external network, threatening not just the internal routines of Angel's Rest, but the entire web of alliances, shipments, and professional collaborations that sustained the family's empire of terror. They intercepted communications, subtly altered instructions to slave catchers and external partners, and introduced discrepancies in records sent to medical schools, creating confusion that undermined the family's credibility and exposed gaps in oversight that had previously seemed impossible to exploit. Every delay, misdirection, and corrupted document compounded into a cascade of consequences, forcing Miriam, Cain, Abel, and Seraph into reactive, often contradictory measures that eroded their confidence and amplified internal tensions as blame shifted and authority wavered. The sisters' influence over the children now became a force multiplier. Small acts of observation, signaling, and misdirection allowed the younger generation to amplify disruptions across the family's external operations, ensuring that the ripple effects of sabotage extended far beyond the immediate confines of the chapel. Angel's Rest, long a meticulously maintained instrument of fear, surveillance, and control, became a living battlefield where observation, intelligence, and strategic patience allowed the sisters to turn the Whitworths' own mechanisms of power against them, exploiting overconfidence, rigid routines, and moral blindness. Each successful act of disruption not only weakened the family's practical control, but also instilled a psychological strain, a creeping awareness that their empire, built on obedience and terror, was no longer infallible. The sisters' patient orchestration of chaos transformed fear into leverage, obedience into illusion, and surveillance into a tool of resistance, proving that even the most entrenched systems of cruelty, meticulously maintained for decades, could be destabilized when courage, intelligence, and calculated action converged within the shadows, turning a fortress of domination into a stage for revolt and signaling that the empire of terror was entering its most vulnerable, exposed phase yet. The Selkirk sisters' relentless subversion began to manifest not just in operational disruption, but in profound fractures within the Whitworth family itself, igniting tensions, suspicion, and quiet betrayals that threatened to unravel decades of carefully maintained cohesion. Siblings argued over interpretations of anomalies, questioned the loyalty and competence of each other, and debated strategies for maintaining control, their internal disputes escalating as the sisters' influence amplified inconsistencies and contradictions in the family's operations. Serif's meticulous planning clashed with Cain and Abel's reactive measures. Miriam's charm and manipulative genius could no longer fully contain the growing chaos, and Gabriel's distant oversight began to falter under the weight of disruptions that exposed vulnerabilities he had never anticipated. Even minor errors in judgment, magnified by the sisters' subtle manipulations, created cascading consequences: lost profits, mismanaged communications, and operational misalignments sowed doubt among external partners, while internal mistrust weakened the family's psychological dominance over those they once controlled effortlessly. Angel's Rest Chapel, once a fortress of fear and unyielding obedience, now echoed with tension, hesitation, and a pervasive awareness of vulnerability, as every corridor, cell, and hidden chamber became a theater for observation, resistance, and strategic maneuvering. The children, now fully integrated into the sisters' covert network, acted with autonomy, executing small but critical interventions that magnified discord and leveraged the growing mistrust among the Whitworths themselves. Each fracture, each whispered disagreement, and each miscalculated move reinforced the sisters' position, proving that intelligence, patience, and moral courage could exploit not only the external mechanisms of control but the internal psychological dependencies that had sustained the family's empire of terror for decades. In this environment of escalating tension, the once invincible authority of the Whitworths was no longer absolute. Their power, carefully constructed through fear, deception, and meticulous order, now teetered on the edge of collapse, vulnerable to the patient, calculated resistance of those they had long underestimated. In the final phase of their meticulously orchestrated campaign, the Selkirk sisters delivered a series of decisive maneuvers that pushed the Whitworth empire to the brink, transforming years of subtle sabotage, psychological manipulation, and the cultivation of independent agency among the children into an unstoppable force that the family could no longer contain. External operations faltered as shipments went missing. Communications became unreliable, and alliances with slave catchers, medical schools, and corrupt officials collapsed under the weight of errors, delays, and inconsistencies that the sisters had carefully seeded over months, forcing the family into reactive chaos. Within Angel's Rest Chapel, the fractured authority of Gabriel, Miriam, Cain, Abel, and Seraph was on full display. Their once cohesive hierarchy now a web of distrust, panic, and misaligned priorities, as each sibling scrambled to regain control while realizing that the very foundations of their dominion had been undermined from within. The children, acting as extensions of the sisters' intelligence network, executed final interventions with precision, guiding victims to safety, intercepting critical communications, and amplifying the confusion, ensuring that every attempt at reasserting power only deepened the collapse. Angel's Rest, long a symbol of fear and absolute obedience, now stood as a testament to the fragility of control, where the very instruments of oppression had been repurposed into tools of liberation, turning surveillance, intimidation, and ritual into a theater of resistance. The sisters, having cultivated intelligence, courage, and moral agency into a strategic weapon, demonstrated that even the most entrenched empires of terror were vulnerable to the patient, calculated application of insight and action, and that a combination of cunning, bravery, and unyielding perseverance could dismantle systems built on fear, deception, and blind obedience. As the dust settled and the empire of the Whitworths teetered on the edge of ruin, the echoes of their authority faded, leaving in their place a stark reminder that domination is never absolute, that control can be contested, and that even in the darkest halls of terror, intelligence and courage can ignite a chain reaction capable of toppling centuries of tyranny, proving that knowledge, strategy, and moral conviction are the ultimate instruments of liberation, forever altering the balance of power in the shadows where fear once reigned unchallenged.